who's spoken several times before. In the interest of getting an early start, and in lieu of his past introductions, he asked that I not introduce him, so I'm not, and I won't, and here he is.
About, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago when I said to her, I'm thinking about retiring, she said to me, she sat me down actually, and she said to me, you need something to do in retirement because I'm not going to have you sitting at home doing nothing. Well, that's easier said than done, but as I began to think about it, I realized, hey, I love history, I'm passionate about the Civil War, and I like to write, so why don't I write a book about the Civil War? Well, fortunately, when that thought came to me, I was preparing for a talk I gave about 5 or 6 years ago to this group, to the Roundtable, about the commander of the 1st Colorado Volunteer Infantry, a man by the name of John Potts Slough. Pat, if you could go to the next slide, please. So I was doing this research about John Potts Slough, and I thought to myself, that's him. That's who I want to write about. Well, you could say, why would you want to write about John Potts Slough? I mean, here's a man that virtually nobody has heard of. Even the most avid Civil War buffs have not heard of John Potts Slough. Well, in many ways, Slough's life mirrors United States history in the mid-19th century. Like so many Americans of his era, John Slough was always moving westward in search of new opportunities, from Cincinnati, Ohio, where he was born and he was raised, out to Kansas Territory, where he got there just shortly after the end, or at the end of Bleeding Kansas, and then out to Colorado Territory during the time of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush and the first years of the Civil War, and then eventually to New Mexico Territory, where he served as Chief Justice of the New Mexico Territorial Supreme Court. An ardent Democrat, he served a term in the Ohio House of Representatives as a young man, and then in 1859 as a delegate to the Wyandotte Constitutional Convention, the convention that drafted the Constitution, the state constitution, that enabled Kansas to be admitted to the Union in 1861. He married well, the niece of a United States Supreme Court Justice, John McLean, and that connection helped him earn a commission as a brigadier general and an appointment as the military governor of Alexandria, Virginia from August 1862 through the end of the Civil War. He probably knew Edwin Stanton when he was a young politician, a young rising politician in Cincinnati, Ohio. Stanton would eventually appoint him as one of the judges to the court-martial trials of Fitzjohn Porter and William Hammond, who was the United States Army Surgeon General. He knew Salmon P. Chase, Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and such key Western figures as William Larimer, William Gilpin, and John Shivington. His was an enigmatic personality. He was a courtly gentleman. Contemporaries described him as unfailingly courteous, probably very stiff and reserved, but a man with a very hot temper and an impetuous nature. He ruined his political career in Ohio by slugging another member of the Ohio House of Representatives over a perceived insult. And he lost his life while serving as the Chief Justice of the New Mexico Territorial Supreme Court when he called an opponent a coward and a damned lying thief, and the opponent didn't take kindly to those insults and shot Slough dead in the lobby of the La Fonda Hotel in Santa Fe. So you can see that Slough's life had plenty of interesting material, but Tonight I want to focus on what I think is the most interesting chapter of his life, his command of the 1st Colorado Volunteer Infantry. The 1st Colorado played a key role in the federal victory at Glorieta Pass that ended the Confederate invasion of New Mexico in 1862. 2 days after that victory, Colonel John Slough abruptly resigned his commission as commander of the regiment. He claimed that he had to resign his command because he feared for his life, not from the rebels, but from his own men. So, during the next 45 minutes, I'd like to talk about Slough's challenges with his men leading up to the Battle of Glorieta Pass in March 1862, describe what happened at the battles of Apache Canyon and Pigeon's Ranch, and then reflect a little on what caused John Slough to resign his command. Pat. Now, Colorado Territory was at the very edge of the American frontier when John Slough arrived in late winter, early spring of 1861. Settlement had only occurred 3 years earlier, and although Denver could boast of churches and theaters and social clubs, it was still a rough mining town. A pioneer family described Denver in 1860 as an exceedingly primitive town consisting of numerous tents and numbers of crude and ill-conceived cabins, ill-constructed cabins with nearly as many rum shops and low saloons as cabins. Denver was filled with men running away from past failures or desperate to find new opportunity, desperate to improve their circumstances. For most people who had achieved a certain level of success in their lives, who had achieved a certain level of comfort in their lives, Denver would have been a very hard place in which to live. Yet, in early 1861, John Slough, raised in genteel Cincinnati society and married to the niece of a United States Supreme Court Justice, arrived by overland stage to begin anew in Colorado Territory. Colorado actually was not yet a territory at this time. In 1860, the Rocky Mountain region formed the very western part of Kansas Territory. The chain of events unleashed by the southern states' succession over the winter of 1860-1861 enabled Kansas's admission as a free state, enabled the creation of Colorado Territory. The admission of Kansas had been blocked by Southern sympathizers who feared that Kansas would be admitted as a free state. With secession, the Southern senators departed the nation's capital for home, and without the Southern presence in Congress, Northern senators could admit Kansas as a free state. Well, that left the western part of the old Kansas Territory without a recognized government, leading James Buchanan, now a very lame duck president, to create the territory of Colorado in February 1861. President Abraham Lincoln appointed William Gilpin, and Pat, if you'd go ahead. So President Lincoln appointed William Gilpin, who was a loyal Republican and a man very familiar with the Rocky Mountain region, as Colorado Territory's first governor. Gilpin arrived in Denver in May 1861 to an enthusiastic reception, and Slough was among the notables who welcomed the territory's new chief executive during an afternoon of speeches and a 34-gun salute. Well, it's no wonder that Denver's citizens warmly greeted Gilpin. The territory faced serious problems, not the least of which was insurrection and secession. Gilpin had to prevent Southern sympathizers in the territory from overthrowing his new government and replacing it with one aligned with the Confederacy. So Gilpin moved quickly to squash any effort by Confederate sympathizers to organize militarily, most notably by attempting to buy up all of the arms and ammunition in the territory. And given that the closest federal troops were miles away at Fort Garland and Fort Wise, Gilpin also determined to raise a local militia that could protect Denver and its surrounding mining communities. In early June 1861, on the request of Colonel Edward Canby, and Pat, if you'd go ahead, on the request of Colonel Edward Canby, who was commander of the federal troops in New Mexico Territory, Governor Gilpin initiated the recruitment of 2 companies of volunteer infantry. He commissioned John Slough and Samuel Tappan as the 2 company captains, and the 2 new captains opened recruiting offices in Denver and the mining camps. Slough did not have to wait long for promotion to field grade rank. In mid-August, Gilpin received orders from Headquarters Western Department to increase the territory's volunteer force to 1,000 men. With the order to recruit a full regiment, Gilpin commissioned John Slough on August 26th as its colonel of the 1st Colorado Volunteer Infantry, and Samuel Tappan as its lieutenant colonel. Pat, if you go ahead. Slough and Tappan did not have difficulty filling the ranks. As Lieutenant Byron Sanford of Company H wrote in a letter to his wife Molly, they do not have to drum up the recruits. They come in from all quarters, from the mines, the shops and stores, all ready to fight for their country. Well, Slough quickly had his hands full with his new regiment, or Gilpin's pet lambs, as the 1st Colorado was ironically nicknamed. I named this talk tonight, The Gentleman in the Roughs, after an excellent book by Lorian Foote, one that I would really recommend that you all read. Foote's book is titled The Gentleman and the Roughs, Violence, Honor, and Manhood in the Union Army. Now, in this book, Foote describes a particular type of Union soldier, typically recruited, actually typically drafted late in the war from the lower socioeconomic classes. These men, known as roughs, disdained soldier strap authority, they resisted military discipline, and they reveled in unruly behavior, hard drinking, and fighting among themselves. Now, the 1st Colorado, recruited from men on the very edge of American civilization, both literally and figuratively, had to have had its share of roughs. These were rugged, independent-minded men, many of them miners who had lived hard-scrabble lives in the gold fields before joining the 1st Colorado. Well, Vander Hollister, a private in Company F, wrote a history of the 1st Colorado that does not romanticize the regiment, but relates incident after incident of drunkenness, rowdiness, and general lawlessness. Let me just give you one example of this. During the New Mexico campaign, when the 1st Colorado arrived at Fort Union in northeastern New Mexico Territory, the men promptly broke into the sutler's store and appropriated a pretty significant store of alcohol for their own use. Well, the men proceeded to get rip-roaring drunk and incredibly rowdy. And so one of the regiment's junior officers, a lieutenant by the name of Issa Gray, attempted to restore some order in the ranks, and he approached one of these group of drunken men, and included in this group was a non-commissioned officer by the name of Darius Philbrook, Sergeant Darius Philbrook. And Gray went up to Sergeant Philbrook and he said, "Sergeant Philbrook, get your men under control, stop drinking right now." And Philbrook looked at him and he said, "Lieutenant, what right do you have to tell me to stop, or my men to stop drinking and to return to ranks? Get lost," basically. So Gray said, "You're under arrest, Sergeant Philbrook." And Philbrook pulled out his revolver and shot Gray 3 times. Well, Gray survived his wounding Actually, Philbrook didn't survive the incident because he was promptly put under arrest, court-martialed, and executed. But I mean, this is a good story of what the First Colorado was all about, because here they are in the middle of a military campaign, in the middle of a federal fort, and the men stealing from the sutler's store proceed to get drunk. Their non-commissioned officer refuses a legitimate order, proceeds to shoot the lieutenant. And this is the type of men that were in the First Colorado. So you can imagine the havoc that the First Colorado must have raised in a small town like Denver. Denver had less than 5,000 residents in 1860, and those citizens supported a very rudimentary police force. From the very start of his command, Slough had to confront serious breaches of the peace between his soldiers and the townspeople, Denver citizens. Another example, in August 1861, this is just a few weeks before Slough gets promoted to colonel, soldiers from his Company A got into a fight over a bar bill with a saloon keeper by the name of Moses Adler. And the next night, one of their company's members, a private by the name of Thomas Rogers, went back to Adler's saloon, and standing out in the middle of the street, he said, Adler, come out here, you insulted me and you insulted my friends, come out here and fight like a man. Well, unfortunately for Private Rogers, who was unarmed, Adler came storming out of a saloon, brandishing a knife, went into the middle of the street and sunk that knife deep into Rogers' chest. And Rogers died in a pool of blood in the street. Drunkenness among the enlisted men and non-commissioned officers was an ongoing and extremely serious problem for Slough. By October, Slough had to print a notice in the Colorado Republican and Rocky Mountain News that he intended to enforce the law that prohibited the sale of liquor to soldiers. Now, Denver, at that time, had 35 saloons, or approximately one saloon for every 135 residents. So you can imagine Slough's efforts went for naught. 3 months later, the Herald complained that the law prohibiting the sale of liquor to soldiers was absolutely without force. Civil War soldiers had to have three qualities, to my mind, to win the love or at least respect of their officers. The enlisted men had to feel confident that their officers were actively looking out for their welfare, ensuring that they had adequate food, clothing, and equipment. Second, the men had to feel some sort of personal connection with their officers. The best example of that we all know of is the men of the Army of the Potomac and General George McClellan. And third, the men expected that their officers would demonstrate unflinching courage in the face of the enemy. John Slough failed, or at least was perceived to fail, in each of these three qualities. That the men of the First Colorado were inadequately supplied, at least initially, was not John Slough's fault. Most of the goods, Denver in 1861 had to import virtually everything required by its citizens. Most of the goods destined for Denver had to be transported by wagon train across 600 miles of prairie from the Missouri River. That distance, combined with the threat of Indian and bandit attack, meant that whatever supplies arrived in Denver would be costly and often in short supply. But even if food, arms and ammunition, uniforms and blankets were readily available in Denver in 1861, Governor Gilpin had no money to buy supplies or even to pay the First Colorado. Thomas Carnes, Gilpin's biographer, claims that Abraham Lincoln verbally instructed Gilpin to issue drafts on Gilpin's own signature in order to pay for raising the territorial regiments. So Gilpin, charged with saving the territory from secession, and with orders from Canby to raise a volunteer militia, began to issue drafts in July that he personally promised would be honored. But as early as mid-August, the Denver merchants began to refuse to accept these drafts. They began to refuse credit to Uncle Sam, which was a situation that the Rocky Mountain News described as extremely embarrassing to Captain Slough. And by November, when word reached Denver that the War Department refused to honor the drafts, the merchants completely cut off credit to Gilpin and supplies to the 1st Colorado. Slough was reduced to begging for supplies for his troops. As the winter began to approach and the weather was turning cold, he had to place a notice in the Rocky Mountain News requesting that Denver citizens donate blankets, quilts, and buffalo robes for his soldiers. So without a doubt, the 1st Colorado's lack of pay and supplies resulted in the many instances of petty thievery and the friction between the soldiers and the townspeople. It's not hard to imagine that the men would blame Slough and Governor Gilpin for these shortcomings. But what made matters worse was that John Slough, with his genteel upbringing, his pride, and his aloof character, could not relate to his men. Again, Evander Hollister, who treats John Slough very fairly in his history of the 1st Colorado, describes Slough's relationship with the men during the 1st Colorado's march to New Mexico. After the men had camped for the day, after a very long and grueling march, they gave Slough 3 cheers. And Slough, according to Hollister, raised his cap but didn't say anything. And then Hollister goes on, "How little some men understand human nature. He had been our colonel 6 months, had never spoken to us, and on the eve of an important expedition, could not see that a few words were indispensable to a good understanding." The men seemed to lack confidence in him. His aristocratic style savors more of Eastern society than the free and easy border to which he should have been acclimated, but that is bred in the bone. The men of the 1st Colorado did not like their colonel. They did not like his reserve, they did not like his Eastern manners, and they did not like his efforts to instill discipline. And to make matters worse, Slough's third in command, Major John Shivington, actively undermined Slough's authority in an effort to push Slough out and gain the regiment's command for himself. But that's another story. Finally, a perception existed, promoted by an anonymous letter writer to the Rocky Mountain News, that Slough was a coward. And to understand why Slough got tagged as being a coward, we need to consider the heightened emotion, the heightened wartime emotion of Denver in 1861 and early 1862. Now, Denver may have been on the very edge of the American frontier, but it regularly received the war news. Both soldiers and citizens knew that Confederate Lieutenant Colonel John Baylor and a small force of Texans had invaded southern New Mexico in July 1861, forced the evacuation of Fort Fillmore, captured Major Isaac Lind and a substantial portion of the 7th U.S. Infantry, and declared the Confederate territory of Arizona. And Pat, if you go to the next slide, please. There's Shivington, and the next one. About the same time that Baylor was embarrassing the Federals in southern New Mexico, the Confederate Army under General Johnston and General Beauregard was routing McDowell's troops at the Battle of First Manassas. So it's little wonder that the young men of the 1st Colorado were anxious to go fight the foe, prove themselves in glorious battle, and send the rebels fleeing in ignominious defeat. Members of Company K attempted in October to set up a new company that would go east to fight. And for their efforts to join the war, the ringleaders got thrown into the guardhouse. In November, the same company mutinied again, this time because they had been informed that they were going to serve as foot soldiers instead of mounted infantry. Slough had to disband the company and cashier its captains. Slough had to place a notice in the Rocky Mountain News that any soldiers missing from the new Company K would be treated as deserters if they did not report immediately to Camp Weld. Camp Weld was located about 2 miles south of Denver. That was the camp in which the 1st Colorado trained over the winter of 1861-62. But the greatest threat to Slough's authority occurred in early February 1862. By this time, Confederate Brigadier General Henry Hopkins Sibley and his Army of New Mexico, some 2,500 Texans, had massed at Fort Bliss in preparation for what surely would be an invasion of New Mexico territory and quite possibly Colorado territory. On February 5th, Captain Ned Winecoop, who had assumed command of Slough's Old Company A, drafted a petition urging Slough to order the 1st Colorado to go to the aid of Colonel Canby in New Mexico. Signed by every officer but one at Camp Weld, the petition claimed that the officers felt that they had the right to demand that Slough order the troops to New Mexico. The petition undoubtedly angered Slough, who had no orders from his superiors to leave Camp Weld, but what infuriated him was the anonymous letter that appeared in the Rocky Mountain News 2 days later on February 7th. Signed by Union, the letter claimed that the reason why the 1st Colorado had not marched to the aid of Canby and the New Mexico territorial government was because Slough, quote, the god of war, the great mogul of this Colorado First, would rather be a living coward than a dead hero. Union finished his letter by proposing that Major John Shivington lead the 1st Colorado so that, quote, success is certain. The next day, Slough appeared at the office of the Rocky Mountain News, demanding to see Union's letter, which the Rocky Mountain News' editor showed him. And then Slough proceeded to arrest Captain Jacob Downing of Company D, confining him to quarters at Camp Weld. Pat, if you go ahead to the next slide. On February 19th, Slough and the officers and men of the 1st Colorado received the orders that they had been wanting. General David Hunter, commander of the Department of Kansas, wrote Acting Governor Lewis Weld requesting that he send the 1st Colorado to relieve Canby in New Mexico. Downing's Company D refused to fall in as the rest of the regiment prepared to leave Camp Weld because their captain was still under house arrest. Slough reluctantly had to release Captain Downing after Downing swore that he had not written Union's letter. Downing returned to his old company amid the cheers of the regiment, and the 1st Colorado marched out of Camp Weld for New Mexico territory. Pat, if you want to go to the next one. Now, before we continue the story of Slough and the 1st Colorado, let me give you a little background about the Confederate invasion of New Mexico. Brigadier General Henry Hopkins Sibley had convinced Jefferson Davis during the early summer of 1861 that an army of Texans under Sibley's command could capture Forts Craig and Union in New Mexico territory with their ample supply of arms and equipment, and then move north to Denver and the Colorado gold fields, and then quite possibly march west to California to secure Pacific Ocean ports for the blockaded Confederacy. Well, with Davis's blessing, Sibley returned to Texas, recruited his army, and by February 1862, the Confederate Army was on the Texas-New Mexico border, poised to invade New Mexico. Pat? Now, about 100 miles north, so here's Fort Bliss, where the Army of New Mexico was in February 1862. And about 100 miles north is Fort Craig, or was Fort Craig. And at Fort Craig, Colonel Edward R.S. Canby had assembled about 3,500 U.S. Army regulars and New Mexico volunteers and militia to defend the fort, which was Sibley's first goal in his campaign. Well, Sibley decided that Fort Craig's defenses were too strong to breach, and he chose to flank the fort in the hopes of drawing Canby's forces out into the open field for battle. Sibley succeeded in his plans, resulting in a Confederate tactical victory at Val Verde on February 21st, 1862. That's the day before Slough and the 1st Colorado departed Camp Weld for New Mexico. Despite their defeat at Val Verde, federal forces still held Fort Craig, and so Sibley decided to leave the fort behind and to march north to Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Fort Union. His advance forces arrived in Albuquerque on March 2nd and in Santa Fe on March 10th. At this point, only about 800 U.S. Army regulars and volunteers under the command of Colonel Gabriel Paul protected Fort Union from the rebels 90 miles away in Santa Fe. Now, Paul had been tracking Sibley's advance, and he was sending frantic dispatches to Slough, urging him to hurry the 1st Colorado to the relief of Fort Union. Pat? On March 10th, Gilpin's pet lambs entered Fort Union, having marched 350 miles in 2 weeks, much of that in harsh winter weather. And Slough had pushed his men very hard during this march, especially over the rugged Raton Pass, which is right at the border between Colorado and New Mexico. And during this march, his relationship with his men continued to deteriorate. 2 examples of that. 4 days after the regiment left Camp Weld, Company I refused to break camp and fall into ranks. Now, the men of Company I, who were mostly German, believed that because of discrimination, the company had been allotted only 2 wagons, while the other companies had been given 3 wagons to hold personal belongings. So when Company I refused Slough's direct order to fall in, Slough commanded his old Company A to disarm the Germans. First Lieutenant Charles Kerber, Company I's commander and a German himself, ordered his men to load their muskets and to refuse to be disarmed. Well, Slough decided to raise the stakes. He ordered Company E to load their muskets and to assist Company A in disarming Company I. And then Slough pulled his revolver on Charles Kerber, only to face all of the 40 muskets of Company I. And in fact, the story goes that one member of Company I yelled out, "If you shoot Kerber, you're going to have 40 holes in you." Well, Slough knew that he had overplayed his hand, so he backed down, wheeled his horse, rode away, and Company I got their 3rd supply wagon, or their third personal belonging wagon. And then several days later, a group of soldiers allegedly plotted to assassinate Slough after arranging for the guards surrounding Slough's tent to mysteriously withdraw. Well, the attempt on Slough's life never materialized, but the possibility of a plot supports Slough's contention that his troops tried to shoot him during the battle at Pigeon's Ranch. Pat, next one. Well, the 1st Colorado was well received by the U.S. Army regulars when they arrived at Fort Union, but Slough, ambitious as ever, quickly alienated the fort's commander, Colonel Gabriel Paul by insisting that as his commission predated Paul's commission by just a few days, he outranked the West Point graduate and Mexican War veteran. Canby had instructed Paul not to move from Fort Union, but to harass the enemy by way of partisan operations. But then Canby sent new orders to Slough, apparently giving him latitude to act independently against the enemy as long as he left nothing to chance. Slough decided that because the orders were silent on his remaining at Fort Union, he could move his forces to Bernal Springs, where he would be in a better position to intercept the Confederates on their march to Fort Union. And Paul was absolutely outraged at Slough's plan, especially after Slough stripped the fort of virtually all of its troops and artillery, leaving Paul on March 22nd with a very small contingent to defend Fort Union in the event that the Confederates got around the main federal force under Colonel Slough. Meanwhile, Pat, if you go ahead. Meanwhile, Confederate General Henry Hopkins Sibley had established his headquarters at Albuquerque, and he decided to leave 6 companies with him in Albuquerque, but he sent Major Charles Pyron with elements of the 2nd and 5th Texas up to Santa Fe, and Lieutenant Colonel William Scurry with elements of the 4th and 7th Texas to Galisteo. And the plan was that the two groups would meet in Las Vegas. That's New Mexico territory, not Nevada. In Las Vegas, New Mexico, and then they would march from there up to Fort Union. Glorieta Pass lies about 20 miles to the east of Santa Fe, between the Sangre de Cristo Mountains on the north and Glorieta Mesa on the south. And there's 11 miles between Johnson's Ranch at the western edge of the pass and Kozlowski's Ranch at the eastern edge of the pass. And then the Santa Fe Trail goes through Glorieta Pass. At the western edge of the pass is a canyon known as Apache Canyon. So Pyron and his Texans arrived at Johnson's Ranch the evening of March 25th. He intended to enter Apache Canyon the next morning and advance along the Santa Fe Trail through Glorieta Pass. What he did not know was that Major John Shivington and an advance force of 400 Federals were camped 11 miles away at Kozlowski's Ranch. Early on the morning of March 26th, Shivington sent out 20 troopers to scout the pass. There was, I should say, a very well-known stage stop on the Santa Fe Trail called Pigeon's Ranch. And Pigeon's Ranch's proprietor was a Frenchman by the name of Alexander Valley. And Valley told the federal troopers that he had seen Confederate scouts moving eastward on the Santa Fe Trail. Pat, there's a picture of Pigeon's Ranch in the 1880s. Well, when Valley told the federal troopers that there were Confederate scouts on the Santa Fe Trail, those troopers immediately turned around and went back east on the Santa Fe Trail, and within a couple of miles overcame those Confederate scouts and captured them. Shivington now knew that an enemy force was within miles, and so he and his command set out to engage the Texans. Meanwhile, Pyron, concerned that his 4 scouts had not returned to camp and anxious that they may have been captured by Yankees, ordered a party of 30 troopers and 2 artillery pieces to ride eastward in search of either the missing scouts or the enemy. It was these 30 Confederate troopers who ran headlong into Shivington's column in Apache Canyon. The rest of Pyron's command was not far behind, and they quickly engaged the Union force. Shivington would follow the same tactics throughout the day's battle at Apache Canyon, sending men up the hillsides on either side of the narrow canyon to attempt to outflank the rebel lines while attempting to break the Confederate center with cavalry charges. Shivington's flanking maneuvers forced the Confederates back and farther westward into Apache Canyon as the day wore on. Now, the Federals had the upper hand throughout the entire day, but by late afternoon, Shivington decided to call off any more attacks. I mean, after all, the major did not know exactly the size of the force that he was facing, and so he decided to avoid engagement the next day, March 27th, and to await the remainder of Slough's command to arrive. That respite from battle enabled Lieutenant Colonel William Scurry to bring up the 4th and 7th Texas from Galisteo. And now, Scurry's and Pyron's combined forces totaled about 1,300 Confederate soldiers. Slough and the remainder of the Union forces joined Shivington and his command very early on the morning of March 28th. Even though Slough's men had marched 34 miles in the previous 18 hours, Slough did not give them much time to rest. At 9 a.m., he and his 1,300 troops departed Kozlowski's ranch with the intention of engaging and defeating the rebel army. Slough and his officers had decided on a battle plan that could have spelled disaster for the Federal forces, but as luck would have it, sealed the fate of the Confederate invasion of New Mexico. Just a few miles west of Kozlowski's ranch, Shivington and almost 500 men branched off on the Galisteo Road, while Slough and his 800-man force continued marching westward along the Santa Fe Trail. Slough had sent Shivington and his men across Glorieta Mesa with orders to fall on the Confederate rear just as the main body of Federal troops were attacking the rebel front. Now, given the extreme difficulty of accomplishing a simultaneous attack, given little knowledge of the terrain, no experienced leadership, and no means of communication, let alone dividing your force in the face of the enemy, Slough's plan was dubious at best. Scurry, here's a picture of Scurry. Scurry is now in charge of the rebel forces, and he had no intention of allowing the Union Army to attack him at Johnson's Ranch. So he moved his 1,300 men eastward along the Santa Fe Trail, and just about a mile west of Pigeon's Ranch, encountered the lead elements of Slough's 800-man force. Pat? So the two sides skirmished for about 10 minutes, and then each fell back so that their commanders could assess the situation. Slough realized that he faced the main Confederate body, and so he quickly ordered his troops into a defensive position, with his right occupying high ground on the north side of the Santa Fe Trail. His center, right there, his center defended by his artillery and supporting infantry, and his left anchored on a small hill that's today known as Windmill Hill. Scurry's batteries engaged the Union artillery at the center of their two lines, while the Confederate lieutenant colonel attempted to flank both the Federal left and right. Well, despite their lack of discipline while in camp or while on the march, the 1st Colorado acquitted themselves very well during that day's fight. Just one example of that. On the right, Lieutenant Charles Kerber, the lieutenant who had faced down Slough's revolver in the mutiny over the personal belonging wagons, noticed that there was a gully that ran along the left side of the Confederate line, almost behind the Confederate line. And he realized that his men could actually sneak and flank the Confederate left that way. And so Kerber ordered his men forward along that gully, and they almost reached the Confederate rear when Scurry and his officers noticed movement over on the Confederate left. Scurry sent 2 companies against the single Company I, and in a really vicious hand-to-hand fight that lasted 20 or 30 minutes, at the end, Company I had to withdraw, leaving a third of its men either killed or wounded on the battlefield. Scurry's batteries engaged the Union artillery at the center of their line, while the Confederate lieutenant colonel attempted to flank both the Federal right and left. The 2 Union batteries at the center of the line had success outdueling their Confederate counterparts, but the superior number of Confederate infantry eventually threatened both the Union right and left. So Slough decided to pull his troops back to Pigeon's ranch, where he again placed them in a strong defensive position. So this time he placed his right on Sharpshooter's Ridge to the north of the Santa Fe Trail, and his left flank on Artillery Hill to the south of the trail. And then in the Union center, he placed his artillery and supporting infantry behind an adobe wall that ran from the base of Sharpshooter's Ridge across the Santa Fe Trail to the base of Artillery Hill. Slough undoubtedly was worried. He now knew that the rebels seriously outnumbered his men, but he expected that Chivington's contingent would surprise the Confederates at any moment from the rear. He established his command post on Sharpshooter's Ridge. Now this was a smart decision on his part, because that command post enabled Slough to see the entire right and center of the Union line. And he placed Tappan in charge of the Union left. Now Union, that's the anonymous writer who had implied that it was cowardice that prevented Slough from ordering the 1st Colorado to the aid of Canby in New Mexico. Union interpreted Slough's absence from the front line differently. In a description of the battle that he dispatched to the Rocky Mountain News, Union wrote that Slough's, quote, coward heart blanched before the storm, seeking protection from a stalwart pine far, far in the rear of his command, and there remained until the battle had been fought and won. Confederate Lieutenant Colonel Scurry decided to focus his main attack on the Union center. So twice during the afternoon, the Texans crossed the 400 yards separating their line and the adobe wall, only to be repulsed both times by a hail of heavy canister shot and musket fire. And the Confederates also had no success in turning the flank, the Union left flank, over on Artillery Hill. But on the right, the rebel superior numbers slowly drove back the Colorado troops. By mid-afternoon, the Texans had flanked the Union right to the point where they could pour fire down on the Union artillery and infantry behind the adobe wall. Scurry, realizing that the enfilading fire from his troops up on Sharpshooter's Ridge threatened the Union center, ordered the 3rd and final charge against the Federal batteries and infantry behind the adobe wall. Well, the commanders of the 2 Federal batteries there, watching that Confederate line storm across the 400 yards between the 2 lines, feared that their guns were going to be overrun, and so they ordered their men to limber up and to pull the guns back. And with the retreat of the 2 Federal batteries, the Federal position became untenable. So Slough ordered his troops back 3/4 of a mile to the east of Pigeon's Ranch to form the 3rd and final defensive position of the day. Now the rebels half-heartedly tested the Yankee lines, but Scurry, realizing that his men had reached their limit and that dusk would soon be falling, decided to call off the attack. Meanwhile, Slough ordered his men to fall back on Kozlowski's ranch, thereby giving up the field of battle. The Texans had won the day. Or had they? What had happened to Major John Chivington and the remainder of the Federal force? Well, Chivington and his men had crossed Glorieta Mesa intending to eventually march west on the Santa Fe Trail to fall on the Confederate rear. Those were Slough's order, and it's important. Those were Slough's orders. But instead, Chivington and his men fell upon a much greater prize, the Confederate supply train at Johnson's Ranch. Scurry had failed to properly protect his supply train. He had left only one cannon and a contingent of about 200 sick and wounded Confederate soldiers to protect his supply train. And so Chivington's men easily scattered or captured the Confederate defenders, and then the Union troops spent the entire afternoon destroying every single supply, every single wagon, and killing every single mule in the Confederate supply train. So the Texans may have occupied the battlefield at Pigeon's Ranch, but without any supplies, Scurry had no choice but to return to Santa Fe. And shortly thereafter, Brigadier General Sibley ordered the Army of New Mexico to begin the long march back to Texas. Well, Slough could not pursue his opponent as the Texans retreated to Santa Fe. Colonel Canby had set him strict orders to return to Fort Union and to hold it at all hazards. Slough could not interpret Canby's orders anyway but to leave the Confederates behind and take his men back to Fort Union. On March 30th, 2 days after the battle, the Federal troops arrived in Bernal Springs. Well, the men were angry and unhappy that Slough had denied them the chance to destroy the rebel forces. And then Slough surprised them again by announcing that he was resigning his commission. About a year later, Slough would write Samuel Tappan that Union troops had fired a volley at him during the Pigeon's Ranch fight, and that he had decided to resign as a result of that threat on his life. Now, we've seen that there was no love lost between many of the men of the 1st Colorado and John Potts Slough. But to me, Slough's concern about being shot by his own men seems more like a rationalization made up by a man who did not want to have the real reason for his resignation made public. Don Alberts, the author of the most comprehensive study of the Battle of Glorieta, suggests that Slough had decided that a hasty resignation would prevent any possibility of censure or even court-martial stemming from Slough's liberal interpretation of Canby's original order to protect Fort Union. Albert's explanation is a reasonable one, but again, I question why Slough would have resigned so rapidly, just 2 days after the battle, without waiting for Canby's reaction to the Union victory at Glorieta. It seems unlikely that Canby would have disciplined a commanding officer whose troops had just won such an important victory. I think it was Slough's ambition and impulsivity that led him to resign. William Clark Whitford, in his 1906 study of Colorado volunteers during the Civil War, suggests that Slough resigned in disgust once he received Canby's incontestable order to return to Fort Union. Denied the opportunity to pursue the fleeing rebels, Slough may have responded with his characteristic anger and impulsivity by resigning his command. He also had to realize that there would be little opportunity for glory way out west in Colorado Territory, and that returning east held out much greater promise for advancement. His ambition, coupled with his disastrous relationship with the 1st Colorado, caused him to give up his colonelcy. And a brief article in the Rocky Mountain News from June 11, 1862, supports this possibility. It noted that now that the rebels had withdrawn from New Mexico, Slough's life as colonel of the 1st Colorado would be, quote, too inactive to suit him. In other words, for an ambitious man, duty on the frontier would be intolerable. Well, whatever the reasons for his resigning, Slough left Denver in early May to reunite with his family in Cincinnati. Then, during the next few months, he commanded a brigade at Harper's Ferry, and in August 18th of Alexandria, Virginia, a position that he would fill until the war's end, and that would eventually earn him promotion to the rank of brigadier general. As for the other story that I alluded to, Major John Shivington's efforts to undermine John Slough's authority did lead to his promotion to colonel. A few weeks after Slough's resignation, the men of the 1st Colorado requested that Colonel Edward Canby promote Shivington to command of the regiment. Canby complied, leapfrogging Shivington over Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Tappan. 2 years later, in November 2.5 years later, in November 1864, Shivington commanded the Colorado Volunteers at the Sand Creek Massacre, an event that would ruin Slough's reputation militarily and that would haunt Shivington for the rest of his life. Thank you.